Good morning. I'm glad you've decided to join in today, and I trust that everyone has had a great week. It's been quite an exciting week for my family with the arrival of our new little baby boy Green. And of course, he's just perfect and remarkable. Last week, our lesson focused on Isaiah chapter 46, where the prophet Isaiah chastised Judah for their idol worship, but he also gave an encouraging message that God, although would send them into exile, they would be redeemed and restored and brought back to their native land. Now, if you've been in on any of these lessons, you know that I like to go through the parts that are left out. So in chapter 47, the focus then turned to Babylon and the downfall that they were going to experience at the hand of God. It would be with Cyrus, the king of Persia, but they could only overcome Babylon because of God's plan. But it was because of Babylon's sinfulness that they would even fall. Now, they were not a nation with whom God had made a covenant, but the message rang clear that God did not approve of injustice or sin from any group of people. They would be the nation that would bring about oppression to God's people, but that was only because they were being used by God to fulfill his word to Judah. In chapter 48, the prophet then turned to the house of Jacob. And house of Jacob referred to the time in Israel before they were divided between the northern tribes and the southern tribes. So he was reminding them that their sins, and it was mostly the sins of idolatry and hypocrisy, not the power of Babylon, but their sins were the reasons that they were becoming captives, or that they would be exiled and be captives. They would experience delivery only by the grace of God and for the sake of God. God would execute their deliverance in such a way that it would be a sign to all of the nations that God of Israel is the one and only true God. So that brings us up to our lesson scriptures today, which are in chapter 49, and the first verses are 1 through 3 that I'll read now. Listen, O owls, unto me, and hearken, ye people from far. The Lord hath called me from the womb. From the bowels of my mother hath he made mention of my name. And he hath made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand hath he hid me, and made me a polished shaft. In his quiver hath he hid me, and said unto me, Thou art my servant, O Israel, in whom I will be glorified. The idea of a servant was an important message throughout the book of Isaiah. Now, Israel, or the remnant of believers, was called to be the initial servant. Israel at the beginning, but now it's the remnant. And in these verses, another servant was suggested. The isles, or the coast, or the inlands, depending on which translation you read from, what it meant was all people from afar, from all nations, were called to listen to the words of the prophet. Most of Isaiah's prophecies had been directed only to Israel, or to Judah, but this one was for all people, all over the world. The verses revealed the servant's testimony. He said, the Lord called him. And that was a clear indication of the validity and the authentication of the servant, that he would be speaking on behalf of God. He would act on God's authority. He would not be expressing his own views, but what God would have him to say. He was called for a particular service before he was even born. The servant's words would be like a sharp sword, though. They would be able to judge thoughts and intentions of the heart. They could go deep into a person's heart. And the servant would be hidden. He would be protected, and he would be revealed at God's timing. And he would be hidden like a sharp arrow in a quiver. Now, I've got a son that's a real hunter, so I know what a quiver is, but in case you don't know, it's that little container that goes on the back of your back where you put your swords in if you're hunting with a bow and arrow. But he said he's going to be hidden. This servant would be hidden like an arrow in the quiver, but he would be ready to be pulled out and shot at the appropriate time. The people of that day expected a military deliverance because Israel had been a powerful nation and now they were under the servitude of other powerful nations. But he said in these verses, this servant would be using God's words and not military force. In Isaiah's time, the servant was the remnant of the faithful believers, but that was later clearly referring to an individual and not a group of people. Now, the nation's servant, Israel, had failed to glorify God, but this individual servant would be the representative of Israel, the nation, and this servant would glorify God, which was the true purpose of any servant, would be to glorify God. The nation had failed, this individual would not. All right, so then now we get to verse 4. Then I said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for naught and in vain. Yet surely my judgment is with the Lord and my work with the Lord. I'm sure that there's been some time in each and every one of your lives when you've tried to teach someone a skill. And try as hard as you may, that person just could not get it. Maybe it was your child. You're trying to teach them to get themselves dressed in the morning. Teachers probably experience that a lot. They make the greatest lesson plans. They spend a lot, I know, you spend a lot of hours, a lot of times at home, planning lessons and planning activities to try to teach something to your children at school. And in my class, the message would be, it was a math class, and they'd say, well, I don't get it. Well, then my next question would be, well, which part or which step did you not understand? And their response would be, I just don't get it. Well, then you start from scratch and you try different words. Now, in this verse, the servant is voicing frustration. Evidently, the people that were listening to the message was, I don't get it. They didn't get it. They were experiencing a frustrating ministry where people listened, where very few listened, and then some of them just flat out rejected the message. Not only did they not listen, they may have listened and then it's, well, I just don't believe that, or I don't get it. The servant had used up his strength and it seemed that all was hopeless. And maybe you've been at a point like that in your life too. Like, I've done everything in the world I know to do and nothing has worked. Nothing gets through. But then this servant remembered that his judgment is from God, from his work with God. He had been obedient to God's calling, and the success of what he had been called to do and what he had done was now in the hands of God. God would be satisfied with his work because he had fulfilled his mission, and he would be judged by the fulfillment of his calling and not by the outward results, or he's not responsible for how the people that listened responded to his message. He's only responsible to God for fulfilling his calling. And I'm sure there are many times that preachers have preached and they just feel like it's falling on deaf ears. And maybe it would be good for them to remember this too. They're judged by God on how they fulfilled the calling, not how the people responded to the message. Now, we'll go to verses 5 through 7. Okay, so 5 through 7 says, And now saith the Lord that formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob again to him. Though Israel be not gathered, yet shall I be glorious in the eyes of the Lord, and my God shall be my strength. And he said, It is a light thing that thou should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob. Now, that was a light thing. That was the narrow focus of the servant's mission, because it was obvious that they were going to be preserved because they were God's chosen people, and they were the ones that was to take the message to the rest of the world. It was through them that God would deliver the rest of the world. So that was the narrow focus. And it said it's a light thing that they would rise up Jacob. But it says now, I will also give thee for a light to the Gentiles. In other words, I'm going to let you, my servant, you're going to bring Jacob, Israel back, but I'm also going to give you a light to the Gentiles. And everyone who's not a Jew is a Gentile. So that would be me and a lot of other people that might be listening to this lesson. He said, so I'm going to make you a light to the Gentiles, that thou mayest be my salvation unto the end of the earth. So it seems in these verses here, oh, and I don't think I read 7. Here's verse 7. Thus saith the Lord, the Redeemer of Israel, and his Holy One, to him whom man despiseth, to him whom the nation abhorreth, to a servant of rulers, kings shall see and arise. Princes also shall worship. To those people, a king and a prince and a ruler, they were the most important people on the earth. But he said, those are going to also worship because of the Lord that is faithful and the Holy One of Israel, and he shall choose thee. So this message was for the Gentiles, and he said, not only that, but these important people, or these people that you deem so important, they're also going to recognize that I am the God of Israel. So it seems now that the identity of the servant in these verses has changed from the remnant of believers in Israel to an individual person. So this servant was formed and called in the womb. He didn't grow up and have a job or a career. It was a calling from before he was born with a clear purpose. Now, when you hold a newborn baby, just like we've gotten to do this week, you see that miracle, the miracle of a child being formed and growing and then being born. That's a miracle. But can you imagine the miracles that we don't see? That God knew this child before birth, before we even got a chance to see its face, yet God already has a plan for that baby's life. Just like he had a plan for each and every one of our lives before we were born. Now, we might not go with that plan because sometimes we're a very stubborn and belligerent group of people, but God had a plan. Now, when Israel went into exile, they had lost their relationship that they had had with God. But they were never cut off completely from God because he would never leave his people. Sometimes he has to back away and say, okay, you go ahead and do things your way. But being restored and returned to the promised land was important. However, the servant's job was also not to just restore them physically or geographically, but it was to restore them to their former righteous relationship with God, to bring them back to a right relationship with God. And not only would this servant be Israel's redeemer, but he would also be a channel for the righteousness for the Gentiles as well, for everyone outside of the Jewish nation. The servant would be God's weapon and a means of salvation for the entire world. He would be favored by God, but he would also experience shame and hate. It says that he would, can't find it in the scripture right now, but it says that he would do that. Now, it's pretty easy for us on this side of the cross to know exactly what and who Isaiah was talking about or who he was foretelling. But for the people who were listening at that time, it must have been pretty confusing that God is talking about a servant who is favored, yet he's going to allow that servant to experience shame and persecution or rejection. Now, they, keep in mind, expected a military Messiah, a military king who would come in and put all the powerful nations to shame. So they're probably wondering, how could a shamed servant be their redeemer? And if you think about the word servant, that's someone who serves another. So that was probably very confusing to them. How can this shamed servant be their redeemer? They need a military power to come in. That's what they thought. So the next verses address the actual mission of the servant, and that would be verses 8 through 12. Thus saith the Lord, in an acceptable time have I heard thee, and in a day of salvation have I helped thee, and I will preserve thee, and give thee for a covenant of the people to establish the earth, to cause to inherit the desolate heritages. And this is God speaking, telling what he's going to do with the servant. This is the mission that he's given the servant. that thou mayest say to the prisoners, go forth to them that are in darkness. And those that are in darkness, of course, right now it would be the Israelites. They felt like they were in darkness because they were in exile, it was foretold. But show yourselves. But it's also people who live in sin. They're in darkness too. And he says, you're going to tell these people, that's okay. You can get out of this darkness. They shall feed in the ways, and their pastures shall be in all high places. A high place is a rocky area on the hillsides. Pastures didn't grow there. But God said, that's where the pastures are going to be. You're going to feed along the way. They shall not hunger nor thirst, and neither shall the heat nor sun smite them. For he that hath mercy on them shall lead them, even by the springs of water shall he guide them. Now, it's a reflection now on when Israel was traveling through the desert on their way to the promised land, where God provided pasture, he provided water, he provided food, he provided all of their needs. So that's a reflection back for them now to remember. And it says, I will make all my mountains away, and my highways shall be exalted. Behold, these shall come from far, and lo, these from the north and from the west, and these from the land of Sinim, I think is the way you pronounce that. All I know is that it is the farthest place that they knew at that time, and it was in Egypt. So he said, from all places of the earth, this is where they're going to come. So you see now in these verses, God becomes the speaker. And he made several promises to assure his servant that his ministry would succeed. He said, first of all, he would answer the servant at the right time. Secondly, he would help. For Israel, that meant help them get out of bondage and back into the promised land. But he's telling the servant he's going to help in that mission that he's given him. He would care for and preserve the servant. And he would be a mediator or a covenant. The servant would become a mediator or a covenant for the people. Now, you know that Jesus mediates for us, but at that time, they may not have understood all of these words that Isaiah has to say. And it was probably strange for a servant to be called a covenant because they understood a covenant to be an agreement. But this servant was going to be a living covenant that would join people to God. He would lead the people out of bondage, out of physical bondage. They would be freed from their exile in Babylon. But also this servant, more importantly, would lead them freed as in like the year of Jubilee. And the year of Jubilee happened every 50 years. When Joshua led the people into the promised land, it was divided into the land sections for 12 tribes. And this was the year of Jubilee, was when the slave, anyone who was a slave was freed. Any land that had been sold for debts was returned to the original owner. So it was maintaining the position that the different tribes held when they went into the promised land. It was a time when the nation actually was just going to go through a reboot. Now, it was a time also when their needs were abundantly provided. It just says over here that they're going to feed in the ways. Their pastures would be in the high places. They would have pastures where normally there would be no pastures. There would be water, there would be no hunger, and there would be no thirst. Now, that's a time sometimes when our problems come into our lives, when we get everything is met, when we have all of our needs met, we forget and we think that we have become self-sufficient. That's when we start getting ourselves into trouble, when our needs are met. When we don't have anything and we have to rely on God, then we know. But and it's happened with the Israelites too, everything was wonderful in this new promised land and they began to veer away from God. But he says right now, what's going to happen is they're going to be led out of this darkness. And they were there, remember, because of their unfaithfulness to God, but they were going to be led out just like they were led out originally, physically, to this homeland. He was going to provide their needs, their food, their water. Barren heights didn't usually have good grazing grounds, but God was even going to make these areas provide for their needs. He would also give them protection from the desert heat as they traveled, and he would lead them near springs of water. And Isaiah once again reminded them that God was a God that could be counted on. And you might wonder, well, how many times do they have to be reminded of that? How many times has God taken care of them since they were in slavery in Egypt? How many times do they have to be reminded? But they're humans just like we are. How many times do we have to be reminded? Okay, you need to take out the trash. Oh, did you take out the trash? I thought you were going to take out the trash. Well, you still didn't take out the trash. We have to be reminded of things that are simple that aren't even that important. I guess if it's the trash being taken out and picked up, that's important. But he had to remind them multiple times that God was a God that could be counted on. Not only that, but he is the creator of everything. He's the creator of the mountains and the highways. He said, I will make all my mountains a way and my highways. God, they belong to God. In other words, nothing could keep God from rescuing his people. But not only would he be rescuing Israel, but people as far away as they knew at the time from all directions would recognize and come to a right relationship with God. They would have an opportunity to come to a right relationship with God. People are still stubborn and some still reject. But our last verse for today is verse 13. And it says, Sing, O heavens, and be joyful, O earth, and break forth into singing, O mountains, for the Lord hath comforted his people and will have mercy upon his afflicted. This last verse is one that gives praise and worship to God for all that has happened. And a lot of times that's where we fall short. We don't have a problem praying and asking God to answer a prayer. And then when it's answered, our prayers are answered, or when we have everything that we need in life, that's where we fall short and we forget to praise and thank God for all that he's done. But this last verse here was a praise and worship verse. And it says there are two reasons that this worship would be included in the heavens and the mountains and the earth. First of all, the people faced consequences of captivity, but God was going to provide deliverance and restoration. He comforts his people with his promise, and God has compassion for oppressed people. There will be a day when he will vindicate his servant who was oppressed or frustrated or hated or rejected. There'll be a day when he would vindicate this servant and the people who responded to him in faith. So now, the big mistake of Israel was idol worship. And I want you to think about the state of being in our country today and the squabbles that we've had, and people fight over the freedom of speech, freedom to bear arms, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom that the Constitution has given each and every person in this nation. But now, the fight for our freedoms and for the right for us to do and live how we please, has that become an idol in the United States? Is it that we expect to have those freedoms, or is it because I want to live a sinful life and I want to find a way to justify it? And we might also remember that God used a small remnant of believers to restore Israel. There are many people upset over the recent election results, but what we have to do is remember that God uses all kinds of people to fulfill his plan. He uses godly people and he uses ungodly people. But what he does depend on is having a remnant, and we need to concentrate on believers being the remnant that God can use to redeem and restore our nation, just like he used a remnant to redeem and restore the nation of Israel. And some other questions and ideas that you might want to consider from this lesson. Think about examples in the Bible where God used difficult situations to bring about his purposes. Remember, Joseph was sold into slavery to Egypt by his brothers, no less. What a difficult circumstance that was. And look how that turned out. He saved the nation of Israel during a time of famine because of his position that he had earned in Egypt. And then for fear of his death, Moses was hidden in the bulrushes. And then he was raised by Pharaoh in Pharaoh's court. Well, he was the one that could come back and lead the people out of Egypt. And I'm sure you can think of many other instances in the Bible where difficult situations were used to bring about God's purposes. And you might be able to even reflect on a time in your own life when God used a difficult situation and it ended up in a positive way. Sometimes we may have to live past a circumstance and into another part of our life, another chapter of our life, to look back and see, well, that's not what I asked for, that's not what I prayed for, that's not what I expected, but it was God's plan, and God's plan prevailed. So, how does knowing how this story of redemption ends help us to get through our difficult times in our lives or our strives? Knowing God's power and his control over all things, does that prompt us to go straight to him when we face difficult times? Or are we like Judah, who called on other gods, the idol gods, or other nations when they called on Egypt? Are we like that? Do we call on everything else first, or do we go to God first? I'd like to thank you for joining the lesson today. I hope you have a great week ahead of you. And remember that we have in-person Sunday school at 9 o'clock on Sunday mornings if you can join us there. I think it might be a little bit more relaxed than me sitting here talking all by myself, because I'll get to see your faces. So I hope you can join there. And I hope that we all remember to stay safe. We can't drop our guard when it comes to the virus because it spreads still. And I thank you for joining, and I hope you'll join again next week.